The holidays are here, and so is the perfect way to bless your loved ones. The Crosswalk Holiday Gift Guide has something for everyone on your list. The team at Crosswalk has handpicked the best devotionals, picture books, middle grade fiction, and adult fiction, so that you can spend less time buying and more time giving to those you love most. So stuff these stories into your stockings and celebrate the wonder of reading this Christmas. Want our gift guide? Visit crosswalk.com/gift guide today.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy Podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. For this installment of the Catholic Church in the United States from 1776 to 1861, I am very excited to be joined by Professor Andrew Hartman. You'll remember Professor Hartman as a guest on our previous series on the history of the Catholic Church in Europe during the tumultuous 19th century. Now he's back to discuss his new book, which he teased a little bit the last time he was on, named Karl Marx in America. We will discuss Karl Marx's impact on the equally tumultuous 19th century in the United States. Professor Hartman was working on this book the last time he was on, and now it is out. I can't wait to discuss this fascinating story. Before we get started, Professor Andrew Hartman is a professor of history at Illinois State University, where he teaches courses on U.S. intellectual, cultural, and political history, as well as courses in the philosophy of history, historiography, and pedagogy. Before we get started, Professor Hartman, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what was the genesis of writing a book about Karl Marx and his impact on American history?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Stephen. So in my early 20s, started reading Marx and kind of Marxism, a whole sort of host of Marxist literature, political philosophy, and that was even before I went to grad school. When I went to grad school, I joined a Marxist reading group while in grad school. So I've been kind of fascinated with Marx for a very long time. But when my early scholarship was not about Marx, maybe was from something of a Marxist bent, sort of, but I kind of stayed away from Marx as a topic. But then I wrote a few books and I got tenure, and I thought that I wanted to return to Marx, but in what capacity was kind of a question. And I had been reading these books, this subgenre of intellectual history called reception history, and I was quite fascinated by it. I think the best in the genre is Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen's book, American Nietzsche. Taking a thinker, a European or some sort of thinker or body of ideas across American history and how Americans have put those ideas to use. That was kind of a fascinating thing to me. And I thought to myself, well, that would be really fun to do with Marx, combining my passion for Marx and Marxism with my expertise in U.S. intellectual history. And I thought, like with these other books, there are books on Nietzsche, Adam Smith in America, John Locke in America, Edmund Burke in America. I thought mine would make a nice little 250-page book, but I think that was 10. Now we're 10 years later, and I have this 600-page book, which easily could have been 1,000 pages if my editor had allowed for such insanity. This kind of highlights one of my most surprising findings, and that is how many Americans over the last 175 some odd years have read Marx, written about Marx, tried to put Marx to use in some fashion.
Now, in America, Karl Marx and Marxism is almost a bad word. Can you maybe explain who was Karl Marx, just in the broadest strokes, and maybe why does he get such a bad rap in America in particular?
Well, of course, the biggest reason he gets such a bad rap is because he's considered the sort of grandfather of communism, the original philosopher of the system that emerged in the Soviet Union and later in China and other countries. And so the Cold War has a lot to do with the demonization of Marx. That is for sure. But even before the Cold War, Marx's ideas challenged people with power in the United States. And so there were, even well before the Cold War, all these sort of mini Red Scares in which Marx would get blamed for things such as the Paris Commune of 1871, or the Great Railroad Strikes of 1877, or the Homestead or the Haymarket Affair of 1886 in Chicago, in which police were, a bomb was set off amongst police and lots of people were killed and arrested and hanged. This latter, because it happened in 1886, 3 years after Marx's death, began the long tradition of Marx getting blamed for things that happened after he had died. And so Marx's ideas indeed did represent a challenge or a threat to particular aspects of American life, specifically capitalism, but to some degree also religion and the commitment to Christianity, and to some degree the American commitment to what they considered democracy, because Marx had different ideas about democracy. Marx himself, I argue, was a philosopher of freedom, and emerged out of traditions in European thought related to liberalism and republicanism, which kind of came out of the French Revolution. But he extended ideas about freedom beyond where liberals and small R Republicans thought about freedom, extended it all the way to the sort of like bowels of society, as people have argued, extended them to the working class, and argued that society isn't free, society isn't democratic unless people have control over their own labor. And in capitalism, where the majority of people, the proletariat, Marx argued, had to sell their labor in order to survive, well, then you can't really have social freedom in those conditions. And because the United States has always been so committed to capitalism, that's where the antagonism lies. Sure. So, of course, Marx is not the first communist thinker. Communism has an older tradition in Europe, but he's the thinker who was most responsible for coming up with the sort of ideas about capitalism and how we can move beyond capitalism into something you might call socialism or communism. He often used those two words interchangeably in the 19th century. And his ideas became paramount in, for example, the German Social Democratic Party, which became the most important socialist party in the late 19th century. His ideas became central to several socialist and communist parties around the world in the late 19th and early 20th century. For example, the Socialist Party of America in the United States, with Eugene Debs as its perennial presidential candidate, took up lots of Marx's ideas about capitalism and class struggle and what comes next. But really, he probably doesn't get remembered as the grandfather of communism unless the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 happens in Russia. And in that sense, I would argue Lenin is probably the father of communism, or at least 20th century communism. Lenin was a Marxist. He was an intellectual, deeply grounded in Marxist thought, Marxist theory, and expanded upon that and applied it to the situation in early 20th century Europe, and in particular, Russia. And the implementation of communism or Marx's ideas in Russia has a rocky history. Marx theorized in many places, including his most famous works, the Communist Manifesto and Capital, that socialism would develop when a large industrial working class came together and recognized that the surpluses they had created through their labor did not need to all go to the rich or the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, the people who own the means of production, that they could take control of the means of production and share or distribute the surpluses of capitalism, the wealth, equally. The problem with applying those ideas in Russia is that they had not long had an industrial revolution. It was pretty minor to the overall population of Russia, which was still sort of a peasantry. In Europe throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century, Russia was thought to be quote unquote backwards, which was manifested in the fact that most Russians were poor. Most Russians still lived rural lives, peasant lives, and something like 98% of the Russian population, for example, was illiterate at the time of the revolution in 1917. And they didn't have the surpluses that capitalism had created in places like Great Britain or the United States. And so trying to establish communism, trying to redistribute the wealth in a place where there wasn't wealth, where there weren't these surpluses, trying to undergo a rapid industrial revolution in a place that hadn't yet undergone that through capitalism, I think opened up many historians, Marxists and otherwise, have argued that sort of created the conditions for pretty extreme political repression of the sort that Marx in his lifetime always opposed. And so the ways in which Marx's ideas were implemented in the 20th century communist systems would have been hard for Marx to imagine, I would think, in the 19th century. And yet, that said, the Soviet Union was able to industrialize rapidly and I guess you might say catch up to Western industrial nations quite rapidly due to the collectivization of the rural life, which was devastating, but also quite effective at allowing this rapid industrialization. So much so that the Soviet Union was able, with, of course, help from the United States and the Allied nations, to defeat the Nazis in World War II, something that probably would have been difficult to anticipate in 1917. Also, lots of other nations, China, but several other of the nations which were seeking to gain independence from Western colonial powers, took up Marxist, Leninist ideas and sought to create communist states as the best method for gaining grounds as independent nations relative to Western imperialist nations. And so even though I think the history of 20th century communism in the grand scheme of things is rather bleak and rather against the grain of Marx's thoughts about how socialism could bring freedom to the masses, it's also a contradictory history, and it's not entirely, there was lots of progress made as well.
Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today.
Looking for a simple way to stay rooted in God's Word every day? The Daily Bible Devotion app by Salem Media gives you morning and evening devotionals designed to encourage, inspire, and keep you connected with Scripture. Plus, you'll enjoy daily Bible trivia and humor, a fun way to learn and share a smile while growing in your faith. Get the Daily Bible Devotion app for free on both iOS and Android. Start and end your day with God's Word. Search for the Daily Bible Devotion app in the App Store or Google Play Store and download it today.
And so you really bring up an excellent point that maybe Russia at that point and China were not as fertile ground for socialism and these ideas of Marx, but in a lot of ways, early 19th century America was a lot more fertile ground. And were there some people dipping their toes a little bit into these ideas that Marx was espousing, and maybe some of the ideas where Marx was drawing from?
Yes. The great irony, the great contradiction of Marx and Marxism in the United States is that, according to Marx's theories, it might have been the place where socialism would have had its most success, at least in terms of socialism being predicated on the economic surpluses created by capitalism. And yet the United States is the nation that probably has been historically the most anti-Marxist or anti-communist. So there's this great contradiction there that I explore in the book. But Marx looked to the United States from an early point in his life as sort of material for trying to understand where socialism might develop or what might come after capitalism, even as capitalism really in its industrial phase is in its infancy. So he would read these travel logs from people like de Tocqueville and Beaumont and others, these rather conservative, sort of aristocratic Europeans who had traveled through the United States and written books about their observations and experiences. And for Tocqueville and the others, they tended to be quite sort of dismayed or pessimistic about what was happening in the United States because they saw the emergence of democracy, which you might see in the sort of Jacksonian period of U.S. history, when all white men were able to gain the right to vote. They saw this as a sort of like lowest common denominator society, a very base society that had sort of gone against the grain of the best of European civilization. So they were quite dismayed by that, both culturally and politically. Marx read these and had the very opposite interpretation and thought, well, this is great. Maybe, just maybe, in the United States, because American workers have the right to vote, they will usher in a sort of more libertary system in which workers have power, and they'll sort of overcome the hierarchies built into the emergent capitalist system. He looked to examples of the Working Men's Party in the United States, which had first formed in 1829 in Philadelphia and then a year later in New York City. These were, I guess, incipient or proto-Marxist parties in that they were looking to create working class power at a very early stage in the American Industrial Revolution. Marx looked to them for hope. He looked to the United States for hope. But over the course of the 1840s and 1850s, he also recognized, due to his close study of the United States and his correspondence with Germans who had emigrated to the United States, especially after the revolutions of 1848, he looked to the United States with more skepticism. He recognized that there were a couple of big historical developments in the United States that were preventing the kind of working class socialist solidarity and consciousness that he knew would have to happen if there was going to be socialist revolution. He was dismayed by slavery. He was very anti-slavery, not just on moral grounds, although it is important to note he was against slavery on moral grounds because he was against all such impositions on free labor. But he also was dismayed by the West, the frontier. Lots of his German comrades who emigrated to the United States, he would write to them sort of warning that they don't get lost in the West. The reasons why later historians such as Frederick Jackson Turner in his famous frontier thesis thought that the Western frontier was what provided America with its democratic ethos was because immigrants and other working class people in the sort of like crowded, smoke clogged cities of New York and Boston, rather than stay there in the conditions that might lead to demagoguery, they would argue they could move west, and this created a sort of like this renewed American society and created the democratic ethos. For Marx, he thought it just delayed the socialist consciousness that was necessary to move beyond the hierarchies embedded in capitalism. So both the Western frontier and slavery, he understood were were kind of impediments to socialist consciousness. And yet there were lots of people who were in the United States, even before the Civil War, sort of developing pretty radical ideas that Marx could have agreed with, or Marx kind of liked.
One of the things you mentioned in the book was about Marx was considering a move to Texas in his youth. And honestly, at first brush, you might think, well, wow, that's crazy. But really, in the big idea of things, a lot of Germans, especially these 48ers who had fled failed revolutions, some of the failed revolutions of 1848, had moved to places like Texas, like a few utopian communities were set up. I think New Braunfels, north of San Antonio, was one of these communities. There was a few other ones. Was Marx's plan to move, was it serious? And I wonder, you can kind of dip your toe into what ifs. I know a lot of historians don't like this, but I wonder what might have been a what if of a Marx in Texas could have been.
Yeah, so when he was a young man reading these American travelogues, he had sort of imagined or the idea of emigrating to Texas. I don't think it was ever a serious consideration for him, especially after he met his eventual wife, Jenny, because that was like a true love story for those two. He was not going to be leaving leaving for a place like Texas unless she was coming with him. But you're right. Lots of Germans did make their way to the United States. Some did to Texas or other sort of places in the slave South. One that I detail in the book is Adolf Dow, who became a Marxist. He was reading all of Marx's works from a very early stage, and while living in Texas became something of an abolitionist before the Civil War. That did not go well for him, so he eventually ends up moving to the Northeast, in particular New York City. But there are some of those who had moved to a place like Texas. The idea of this sort of wide openness, I think, was attractive to lots of Europeans. Most of the German 48ers who fled the revolution and for the United States ended up in the Midwest, in places like Cincinnati or Milwaukee or St. Louis. And lots of them volunteered for the Union Army when the Civil War broke out, and they were dyed-in-the-wool abolitionists. When they first came to the United States after the 1848 revolutions, they thought their hope was to return to Europe quickly, hoping that the revolutions would sort of break out again and that they could rejoin the fight. That, of course, didn't happen, but many of them recognized that they could sort of help create a revolution of their own in the United States by joining the new Republican Party and by joining the abolitionist movement. And so it was lots of these German 48ers, and these are people with whom Marx kept up correspondence over the years. They helped shape sort of Western front attitudes about the war and about how the war needed to be from the get-go about the abolition of slavery.
There were so many movements going on in this mid-19th century, the Second Great Awakening, the rise of the radical Republicans, the Free Soilers, and they all had elements of socialism in them. What did Marx think about some of these movements? He often comes across as somebody who's very ideological and can more lean towards picking apart his problems with these with different ideas and ideologies. Do you think he saw something in radical republicanisms and Free Soilers, even though they were highly religious, but the groups that came out of the Second Great Awakening that were looking for utopianism and something that looked quite a bit like communism? Did he comment on any of these ideas?
Yes. So I think you're right that he comes across as maybe ideological is the right word, or maybe dogmatic in this sense. He had a clear understanding to his mind what capitalism was doing in terms of creating a proletariat. In other words, ripping people from the land. And this was happening in Europe quite massively at the time, but eventually also happens in the United States, and moving them into like factory jobs or other other jobs where they had to sell their labor in order to survive, and they could no longer rely on sort of the sustenance of the land. And because he saw this as the direction of history, he thought that any attempt to sort of form a politics around preservation of the land, preservation of independence on the land, was, I guess he might have thought a little bit backwards. And that's why he was highly critical of various sort of iterations of this, including utopian socialist communities that were developed in the United States and even in England and Scotland. But on the other hand, there's been a lot of scholarship lately rooting Marx's ideas in 19th century Republican discourse that, to me, has been extremely convincing. And I think there is a lot of overlap between Marx's ideas and Republican ideas in the 19th century. And these Republican ideas informed a lot of the various movements that you speak of in the 19th century that sort of culminate in the Republican Party of the 1850s, which then, of course, culminates in the Civil War and the abolition of slavery that was kicked off by the election of Abraham Lincoln. Here's what Marxism and Republicanism had in common, or Marx's ideas in the Republican discourse. They both hated the fact that some people had power over the other. So both ideologies wanted people to have power over their own labor, power over their own time, that sort of autonomy. Republicanism, on the other hand, was much more sort of focused on arbitrary power. And so you can see this play out in a number of ways. It's sort of anti-slavery elements. The slave power seemed quite arbitrary, both in terms of its power over individual enslaved people, but also in terms of its power over the rest of the nation through its control of Congress. But also you can see this play out in the later populist movement in terms of the belief that Eastern banks and railroad companies were arbitrary forces of power that were sort of cutting into the independence of the prairie farmers who joined the sort of prairie fire, the prairie radicalism of the populists. This is all sort of rooted in 19th century republicanism, and it was quite radical. But Marx, again, believed that the wave of the future was socialist movements, working class movements that were organizing against capitalism specifically. And he thought of capitalism as not an arbitrary power, but as a system, not necessarily as a personal force, but rather an impersonal force. And the only way to organize against that was a large-scale working class movement that wasn't focused on property, but rather focused on gaining control of the means of production, gaining control of the factories, etc.
Did Marx write about or have ideas about the Native Americans and the treatment of them? Because they don't really neatly fit into the ideas and the dialectic, you might say, of socialism and communism and capitalism.
I think it's quite similar to how he viewed radical movements that weren't based in a working class challenge to capitalism. So, for example, in Capital, he has this section on primitive accumulation in which he argues that the necessary precondition for capitalist development were things like imperialism, colonialism, slavery, even genocide. And he's quite sympathetic, I think, to the suffering of people, including Native Americans and other indigenous populations who bore the brunt of European colonialism and even eventually American expansion westward. In all of his writing, he is sympathetic to those who are oppressed, but he also is very sort of future oriented. And I think sometimes people criticize him for this, including like scholars like Edward Said in the late 20th century, who argued that he was somewhat Orientalist because his future-oriented conception of the world, critics have argued, was rooted in sort of like a Western European conception of the world, in that he believed that the industrial capitalism that he was witnessing development in places like London or in places like the United Kingdom was the wave of the future was going to overtake the whole planet. And so any sort of like organizing had to deal or reckon with that. And so like he was quite sympathetic, for example, to various forms of native resistance, but he didn't think that was what was going to topple capitalism. That was not what was going to bring about a better future for anybody.
One of the episodes of early American history and the lead up to the Civil War was with John Brown. In a lot of ways, John Brown was getting done some of the things that Marx was advocating for. Did Marx ever hear of John Brown, and did he have any thoughts on John Brown's rebellion?
Yeah, John Brown's escapades, both the Potawatomi massacre in Kansas and then especially his raid on Harper's Ferry, this was worldwide news. And of course, Marx paid close attention to what was happening in the United States during the 1850s as he was a correspondent for the New York World Tribune during the 1850s. But he of course knew about John Brown, paid close attention to him, and actually wrote quite glowingly about John Brown's escapade. So after John Brown was hanged soon after the raid on Harper's Ferry, Marx wrote kind of poetically about how John Brown was going to be sort of remembered as a revolutionary figure, and that his execution sort of portended the near end of slavery.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
This Christmas, give more than just a gift. Give encouragement, inspiration, and joy. In the Crosswalk Holiday Gift Guide, you'll discover a curated collection of meaningful books and devotionals that celebrate faith, family, and the real reason for the season. This Christmas, we invite you to share comfort, quiet, or excitement with each person on your gift list. From beautifully illustrated Bibles and devotionals to novels and picture books, this guide holds the perfect book for every reader, including yourself. So stuff those stories into stockings, wrap collections with care, tuck a book or two into your own nightstand, and join us in celebrating the wonder of reading this Christmas. Explore the Crosswalk Holiday Gift Guide and find something special for everyone on your list. Visit crosswalk.com/gift guide today.
You speak a little bit about, or you brought up that Marx was a journalist for the New York Tribune. Could you talk a little bit about that? How did he get with the Tribune, and maybe how were his articles and his commentary taken in the U.S.?
Sure. So the New York World Tribune during the 1850s was the most read newspaper in the world. 200,000 subscribers, which just by comparison speaking, the London Times had 100,000 during this time period. It was published by Horace Greeley. It became in the 1850s like the newspaper of the Republican Party. And Charles Dana, who was like one of the editors of the Tribune, traveled to Europe shortly after the 1848 revolution, seeking out a correspondent in Europe who could speak about European affairs and politics for this growing Republican American audience. And he had heard stories about Marx because Marx, during the 1848 and 1849 revolution in Prussia, of course, edited a newspaper in the Rhineland that became quite notorious, and that led to Marx being put on trial and eventually having to go into exile in London. So in 1849, Dana meets with Marx. This might have been 1848. He meets with Marx in Trier, in that part of Prussia, and they talk about the prospects of Marx working for the Tribune. And Marx, he's open to the idea, but kind of busy at the time. So it doesn't actually take place until 2 or 3 years later, but then Marx gets hired by Dana and by Horace Greeley to be the main correspondent for the New York Tribune. During the 1850s, he publishes 512 articles for the Tribune. Now, Engels helped write several of these articles, both because early on Marx's English wasn't proficient, although he got proficient quite quickly. And Engels Engels had a better command of the English language. But also occasionally Engels would help if Marx was busy with something else. I think it's estimated that Engels wrote about 100 of the 512 articles. Most of these were about European affairs for an American audience. They could be quite lengthy, quite analytical, quite of the Marxist variety in which he's subjecting European affairs to his sort of political economic analysis that he's so famous for now. The Tribune did not publish articles with bylines, so lots and lots of Americans were reading Marx without knowing that they were reading Marx. And that had to have included Lincoln, who read the Tribune every day. So it's just an interesting thing that most of the most published Marx ever was during his lifetime was in his New York Tribune writing days, and that was for an American audience.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And it's fascinating that Lincoln would have read Marx. And bringing up Lincoln, I think Lincoln oftentimes, because of the hagiography about him and his essentially martyrdom for the American cause, we kind of skim over some of the things. He was an extremely pragmatic politician, and the way he prosecuted the war and the way his ideas were pragmatic. But he did have an ideological side to him. He had contradictions. He was in a lot of ways for some socialist ideas, but then he was a corporate lawyer as well. What did Marx think about Lincoln?
Yeah, I think you're right that Lincoln, pragmatic's a good word to describe him. I think he had a firm belief in a just world that was anti-slavery. And yet it wasn't really until the Civil War that he developed fully anti-racist ideas. He was pragmatic also in the sense, of course, most famously, that he began the waging of the war merely on constitutional terms to bring the United States back together without necessarily abolishing slavery, in part because he was extremely concerned with keeping the border states like Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky or I should say Tennessee in the Union. Kentucky or Tennessee, I'm forgetting. But the border states in the Union, even though they still had the institution of slavery, and only changed his mind during the Civil War. Marx, not a politician, had much more freedom to be much more grounded in his own ideals. But interestingly, when Marx was writing quite extensively about the U.S. Civil War in the early years of the fighting, both in correspondence with Engels and many of his comrades in the United States, but also in articles he was writing for an Austrian newspaper, Die Presse, he was making the case that the best way for Lincoln and the Union to win the war was to make it a war of emancipation, because that would essentially create another front behind enemy lines. That is, if the enslaved people knew that it was a war about abolition, they would undertake what W.E.B. Du Bois later referred to as a general strike. They would lay down their tools and they would help the war effort. And eventually that's what happens after the Emancipation Proclamation, but it took Lincoln some time to get there. Marx had, as with his general understanding of the United States, had sort of contradictory ideas about Lincoln. On the one hand, he thought that he was too lawyerly. Like when he would read, including the Emancipation Proclamation, which Marx called probably the most important speech of the 19th century, Marx couldn't believe, on the one hand, that it was written in a very sort of lawyerly terms. There wasn't much passion there. And yet Marx thought that this was quite quaint and maybe something to be celebrated, because in Europe in the 19th century, you had these sort of like grandiose rhetorical gestures by these people, these leaders who were autocratic and whom Marx considered buffoons. So he was quite impressed by the fact that Lincoln emerged from working class roots to lead over the United States through the Civil War, and thought that only in the United States could something like that happen. So in fact, Lincoln in the Civil War made him quite optimistic about the United States, and also optimistic about the prospects for the future. The 1850s were pretty depressing for Marx, both at a political and a personal level. Politically, because he was living in exile in London, the 1848 revolutions had been crushed, and the 1850s were quite reactionary in Europe at the time. So the Civil War offered him hope in that sense, and lots of other people as well. The Civil War, internationally speaking, was a moment of hope for lots of revolutionaries, socialists and otherwise, across the planet, and especially Marx. Personally, the 1850s were very difficult for Marx because he was living in poverty in London, and 3 of his children died of the diseases like tuberculosis that poor young people died of during that time period. So the Civil War offered him all kinds of hope. And so even though in some of his letters, especially to Engels, he comes across as quite critical of Lincoln, both strategically and in terms of his lawyerly tone and his rhetoric, I think ultimately he's quite impressed by Lincoln and sees Lincoln as part of the movement of the future, even though he knows quite well that they might disagree on some pretty fundamental issues.
In the book, you mentioned that Lincoln actually had some pretty socialist ideas about labor, ideas that at least Marx might find some common ground with. And you had mentioned this idea of the mudsill theory of labor, and that was something I wasn't familiar with. Could you maybe explain that a little bit and how it applied in this time period?
Sure. So in the 1850s, by that point, because of the rising abolitionist movement and the threat to the institution of slavery, there were several Southern thinkers who became apologists for slavery, who developed theories that not only made the case that slavery was a necessary economic good for them, but also that it was, in fact, a superior system to, say, Northern capitalism. And so James Henry Hammond, of course, articulates this case in sort of elaborating on this longstanding theory called the mudsill theory. And the basis of the theory is that all civilizations throughout human history have some people who work and do the dirty jobs, and others, a smaller slice of the population, who live off that surplus and lead society both morally, intellectually, and politically. And he argued that the South had just merely created a new sort of a new system predicated on this longstanding civilizational tension between those who worked and those who lived off the surplus and led society, but that it was superior because it was providing necessary agricultural labor to the world market, and that it had found a class of people, African enslaved Africans, or the ancestors of Africans, who he thought were best suited for working in the hot sun. So, there's racism, of course, embedded in the mudsill theory, of course, but he also made the case that it was superior to the Northern capitalist system because, of course, the Northern factories, the Northern docks, the mills were also reliant on a class of people to do the dirty work. In this case, he pointed to Irish immigrants who were lesser than other people in society. But unlike in the South, where benevolent slave owners provided food and shelter to their working class, the Northerners didn't even provide them that. So he was making the case not only that this was a necessary good, but also a superior system to the mudsill in the North. Obviously opportunistic, obviously rooted in the context and politics of the 1850s. Lincoln responded to this theory with a famous speech he gave in Wisconsin in 1859, in which he fully sort of laid out his theory of free labor and argued that it's not the case, especially in the United States, that some people are destined to constantly be in the working class, and that some people could, in the United States, through their own hard work, if they had control of their labor, they could sort of rise out of the ranks of the working class. And this is sort of based in the Republican Party theory of free soil, free men, free labor. And this is what motivated lots of people to be anti-slavery, not necessarily for moral grounds, although that's part of it, but also on the basis of the fact that they thought the United States would be the best in the future if people had the ability to work for their own freedom with their own hands. And there's some overlap there with Marx.
And then just to wrap up, maybe give us a little bit of a preview of what happens after the Civil War and with the rise of the Gilded Age. Even though we won't get into that really in too much detail in this series, it's sort of the denouement of the story.
Yeah, so slowly but surely after the Civil War, as you get the rise of corporate America and the sort of like rapid industrialization of the United States and the growing working class, Marx's ideas pick up steam, first probably with German immigrants who could read Marx in the original, but then Marx's ideas spread throughout the nation. By the time you get to the early 20th century, you have socialists who, like, you have black socialists in Harlem reading Marx. You have prairie socialists in Oklahoma reading Marx, in addition to, for example, the German socialists in places like Milwaukee. And so it's kind of like a slow trickle that just picks up steam alongside the Gilded Age capitalism.
So you wrapped up this whole book about Marx in America, and I know it was a huge project. Do you have anything else? What's your next big project in the works?
I'm not fully committed to my next book, but I've got some ideas popping around, and I'm thinking I might write a book called something like Empire and Its Discontents. I'm really interested in anti-imperialist thought throughout American history. So that might be the next one, but I haven't committed to that yet.
That would be a really good one. You're always welcome to come on. Thank you so much for joining us. This was fascinating. People should definitely read the book because we barely scratched chapter 1. So, if people want to find your book or learn more about you, where would be some good places?
It's been published by the University of Chicago Press. They sell it online. You can also find it at all the usual booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I always recommend local bookstores. Lots of local bookstores I know carry the book. So it's pretty much anywhere.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. And hopefully we'll have you on in the future.
Thanks so much, Stephen. This was a lot of fun.
This Christmas, give more than just a gift. Give encouragement, inspiration, and joy. In the Crosswalk Holiday Gift Guide, you'll discover a curated collection of meaningful books and devotionals that celebrate faith, family, and the real reason for the season. This Christmas, we invite you to share comfort, quiet, or excitement with each person on your gift list. From beautifully illustrated Bibles and devotionals to novels and picture books, this guide holds the perfect book for every reader, including yourself. So stuff those stories into stockings, wrap collections with care, tuck a book or two into your own nightstand, and join us in celebrating the wonder of reading this Christmas. Explore the Crosswalk Holiday Gift Guide and find something special for everyone on your list. Visit crosswalk.com/gift guide today.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.